Now that we've talked about different methods for measuring variables, we can move on to what you can do with those measurements, what you can do with the data that you're collecting. We're going to talk about research. And research tends to fall into one of three broad categories: descriptive, correlational, or experimental research. So this video is going to be all about descriptive research. And descriptive research is the kind of research that's going to seek to explain how we behave, especially in natural environments, but not exclusively in natural environments. And the defining factor that will tell us that something is descriptive research is if all of the variables in this research are measured. There's no manipulation, there's no comparison. Descriptive research only involves the measuring of variables. And like I said, they tend to be looking at things in natural contexts. So how do people behave, or how do non-human animals behave in their natural environments? So we could look at something like how often do people take the bus? And you would measure how often people in a given area take the bus. Maybe you're going to use a survey to get that measured. Maybe you're going to set up cameras, but you are going to count how many people take the bus. And maybe you're going to talk about how many people take the bus every day out of the population of the city, or something like that. But everything's going to be measured. You're not really comparing it to anything. You're not necessarily doing any manipulations, making more or less people take the bus, just measuring stuff. And because you're just measuring things, any extraneous factors, any other things going on aren't being controlled. You're not controlling for the fact that maybe it's winter, so fewer people are taking the bus because it's too cold to be on a bus. Or maybe you're not controlling for the fact that it's a rainy day, so maybe fewer people are taking the bus. So there are other factors going on, but we're not really doing anything about it because we're just measuring things. So some examples of descriptive research would include things like case studies, naturalistic observations, or surveys. We've already kind of talked about surveys, but we are going to go into these in more detail, focusing on each in turn. So the first type of descriptive research that I mentioned is a case study. And a case study is a detailed investigation of a single event, a single case. So it could be an individual, a group, or an event. Usually these are going to be single, noteworthy events. So a lot of case studies, especially in psychology, might look at a single individual who has experienced a very unique problem. So one of the most famous case studies that comes up in psychology would be, say, Phineas Gage or HM, both of whom suffered brain damage that led to odd behaviors. And so these would be a case study, two different case studies, because we are looking at an individual. And these case studies give us some decent benefits. You can look at this one odd case in great detail. We know all sorts of information about Phineas Gage's brain and how his behavior changed, all sorts of details about the parts that were damaged and how his behavior changed because of that damage. And these cases can provide us information that helps us build theories or challenge existing theories. So because a certain part of Phineas Gage's brain was damaged and it affected his personality, that gave us more evidence to support the idea that that part of the brain is probably responsible for your personality. You can also have new information. Maybe there isn't a theory yet about what a certain part of the brain does, but if you find a specific case where someone has damage to that area and it's changed their behavior in a particular way, now you can start formulating a new theory that that area is related to that behavior. And it doesn't have to just be brain damage, but in psychology, that seems to be the way we go. You can also look at, say, a group. Maybe we talk about finding a civilization that has been undisturbed and hasn't encountered human contact in centuries. So we could use that as a case study to study how culture evolves independently from the rest of society. Lots of different options. Case studies can be very, very diverse. But as you might predict, there are also going to be some downsides, some issues that come up because of case studies. Because we're only looking at a single case, a single occurrence, it's very difficult for us to determine cause and effect relationships. This might make a little bit more sense once we get into talking about experiments where we're manipulating variables and actually seeing things change. But in a case study, you aren't necessarily sure which event is causing which other event. We can make some logical leaps, things like Phineas Gage, who suffered brain damage because of a railroad spike. We can assume that the damage from the railroad spike caused those behavioral changes, but in other situations, it might not be as clear-cut. Maybe you encounter someone with amnesia who also can't do mental math. Does having amnesia cause them to be bad at mental math, or are both the mental math and the amnesia caused by something else? So a causal relationship, this cause and effect, is really difficult to determine in a case study because we're not manipulating anything. So you have to keep in mind what this information can tell you. We also have an issue with generalizability. And generalizability is basically how can we apply this information to other scenarios. So yeah, it's really cool that we figured out that a certain part of the brain might be responsible for personality because Phineas Gage's brain was damaged and it changed his personality, but he's pretty much the only one who has been stabbed in the head in that exact way that damaged that exact part of his brain that caused that exact personality change. So is everyone's personality centered in that part of the brain, or is it specific to the exact damage that he got? We're not quite sure because it's not ethical to go around stabbing people's brains. So you run into issues of, yes, this was true in this one case, but we don't know what that means for the rest of the population. We're not sure that we can generalize. So again, we have to take our results with a grain of salt. We have to be aware of their limitations. And the last one that we have that's really important with case studies is researcher bias. So in the case of a case study, you usually have one individual or a specific group of individuals or that particular event that are being studied by one or a few researchers. And those researchers might be a little bit biased because, as we said at the beginning of the chapter, humans have bias, and researchers are humans, therefore researchers have bias. So maybe they expect that there's going to be a certain outcome, or they assume that they will see a certain thing, and we end up with bias because their expectations start to shape their perception of the events. Now, this isn't exclusive to descriptive research, and this isn't exclusive to case studies. Researcher bias is a problem everywhere. It can just be especially problematic in case studies because if you're only measuring one person and your measurements are biased, then all of your measurements are biased. So you have to keep that in mind again, and you have to do everything in your power to make sure that you can eliminate that researcher bias if possible. Our next type of descriptive research is another cool one, which is naturalistic observation. And this is when you observe people in their natural environment. So a great example of this would be Jane Goodall observing chimpanzees in the wild. So she went out, stationed herself in the environment, and observed their behavior. There's some advantages here. You can get a rich description of behavior. If you're sitting there watching chimpanzees all day, every day, you're collecting lots of data. You're learning a lot about what they're doing. And there are ways to avoid what are called demand characteristics. And in the last video, we mentioned demand characteristics as being involved when people are changing their behavior when they know that they're being observed. So with naturalistic observation, there are ways that you cannot let on that you're being observed. So we already mentioned about observations where you can use remote viewing. Maybe you set up a video camera. Maybe you can hide your observers so that they blend in with the environment. Or you could do what Jane Goodall did, which is establish yourself in the environment and allow them to habituate or get used to your presence. So what she did was she went and sat with these chimpanzees, and at first their behavior changed. There was demand characteristics because she was different. They knew they were being observed. Their behavior changed. But over time, as they realized that she wasn't a threat, that she wasn't going to interact with them, they became used to her, they habituated to her presence, and their behavior went back to normal. So by allowing them that time to get used to her presence, she was able to avoid demand characteristics in her measurements. So good things about naturalistic observation. And of course, there are limits and issues with naturalistic observation. So, as I mentioned again earlier on, if you are observing someone and not telling them that you're observing them, you run into ethical problems. We get a more cohesive view of their behavior if they don't know that they're being watched, but ethics decree that people have to be informed. They have to give informed consent as part of your research. So we'll get into some of the ways that we deal with that when we talk about ethics. Naturalistic observation also makes it very difficult to study certain things. So if you're trying to study a very particular behavior, and that behavior isn't overly common, you might be waiting a really long time for that to just naturally happen in the environment. Maybe you want to study people's behavior when they break up. Well, you'd have to stake out a whole bunch of couples and wait for them to break up to study that. So it's not necessarily the most logical course of action or the most logical type of research for certain topics. And as you might expect, doing naturalistic observation is going to be a very time-consuming process. You're going to have to do lots and lots of observations, and the more rare the behavior you're looking for, the more time you're going to waste waiting for that behavior to happen. So these are considerations to keep in mind if you're thinking of doing naturalistic observation. And the last type of descriptive research we want to talk about very, very briefly, because we've already kind of touched on this already, is survey research, where you survey participants. You ask participants questions using our interviews or questionnaires, and that's going to give you an idea of the views, behaviors, experiences, or traits of a population. And I like to bring this up again, even though we've already talked about it, because it transitions nicely into talking about populations and sampling, because these are applicable to all kinds of research. So I guess we go to this page here. So when you're conducting research, your goal is usually to try and understand a particular thing, maybe a behavior, in a population, in a group of interest. So we can define our population as the entire set of individuals about whom we wish to draw a conclusion. So our population is everybody that we are interested in. So if you are trying to study depression in university students, then your population is going to be university students. You could specify that you only care about, say, university students in Canada, to make a very specific population. But logically, it's really hard to sample an entire population. It's really hard to survey everyone in a population. It's really hard to get measurements from everyone in a population. You can't talk to every university student in Canada. That's just not viable. And so what we use instead is a sample, which is a subset of individuals drawn from a population. So instead of interviewing every university student in Canada, maybe you're going to take a subset of the students in Canada. Maybe you're going to pick 10 universities spread evenly across the country, and you're going to interview 1,000 students at each. That would be a sample designed to represent the population of university students in Canada. Now, with these samples, it's important to note how you're sampling. What you're aiming for is to have what's called a representative sample. That is, a sample that's going to reflect the important characteristics that we care about of a population. So, a representative sample of university students in Canada shouldn't just be made up of first-year students studying psychology. It shouldn't necessarily only include people of a certain race, or it shouldn't include only one gender. If you want a representative sample, if you're trying to get a good picture of all students in university in Canada, then you want your sample to represent that population. You want to include people from diverse backgrounds. You want to include people from all types of provinces, different years of study, all that sort of thing. So you can decide which characteristics you care about to represent that population, and you can make sure that your sample matches that population distribution. So actually I have a graphic of that here. So we have these pie charts where we have a population and we have A through H. So there's lots of orange, there's only a little bit of blue, little bit of red, lots of light blue over here. So if this is the distribution of our population, maybe this is what people are studying in universities. You have lots of people in the arts, and maybe not too many people in med school, but lots of people in engineering or whatever. If you want a representative sample, then the proportions of people in each of those fields should match. So you should have lots of students in the arts, not many in med school, and lots of people in engineering. If you have an unrepresentative sample, like the pie chart on the top here, you are going to have bias in your sample, where in this case, we ended up studying almost half of the people in our sample ended up being art students. And that's not the same as our population. So this is an unrepresentative sample, and it means that our research isn't necessarily a good representation of the population we're interested in. So how do we get a representative sample? One of the best ways to do that is through a process called random sampling. And this is a method of sampling where every member of the population has an equal chance of being chosen to participate. So if you use a random event to choose who gets to participate in your research, if you are choosing or sampling from the population at random, then by random chance, you should get about the same distribution of whatever traits of interest that you have in your population in your sample. And of course, this isn't infallible, but it is one of the best ways to go about this. So an example would be let's look a little bit smaller for ease of finding a random example, but instead of studying all university students across Canada, maybe we want to survey students at the University of Alberta. A random sampling procedure would be that we could get a list of all of the student numbers of every student on campus, and we could use a random number generator to pick 1,000 students. And because there's a random event deciding who gets to be in our experiment, who gets to be part of our sample, then our sample should match the distribution of our population. We should end up with a representative sample. Now, having a representative sample is sort of the ideal, but we have to keep in mind that random sampling isn't always possible. Sometimes you're going to have to design your research knowing that it isn't possible to get a random sample. It isn't possible to have a perfectly representative sample. And so you have to look at your results from research that's been done on an unrepresentative sample and know that we're not quite sure how generalizable how much we can apply that research to other scenarios because it isn't representative. Now, sometimes it isn't actually a bad thing to not have random sampling. There are specific scenarios where we can actually accept the fact that our sample isn't random and not be too worried about it. The first of these situations where it's okay not to have a random sample is if the similarity of a sample and a population doesn't matter. So if you're looking just to prove the fact that something is possible, then maybe it really doesn't matter what your sample is, because a single case that shows you that that thing is possible is sufficient. I like using the example here of flying pigs. So if you are looking to research flying pigs, I wouldn't necessarily go out and sample as many pigs as I could find. If I could find a single pig that flies, then we would have to change our theory that pigs don't fly, because now we have one that does, so clearly our theory that they don't fly is wrong. So that one case is enough. And so you don't need random sampling because of that setup. Another way that you can be okay without having random sampling is if multiple experiments are conducted on different samples and they all have similar results. So this goes along with the idea that you couldn't random sample, you ran your research on a biased population, on an unrepresentative sampling of your population, and your results weren't necessarily broadly applicable. But somebody else, maybe in a different country, maybe at a different university, maybe they ran a very similar experiment and they got very similar results. And so because you now have agreement between experiments done on two very different samples, maybe you're a little bit more confident that you could generalize your results because you're seeing this agreement in very diverse places. And then for the last point, it could be okay not to have a random sampling if the similarity of the sample and population is reasonable. And this is, I use the example here of brain imaging. In a lot of cases, when you're looking at different brain areas, maybe you just want to look at structures of the brain. Maybe you don't care whose brain it is because you're just interested in getting a view of a human brain. So it doesn't matter if you're studying a whole bunch of university students, because university students' brains don't have very different structures from non-university student brains. So in that case, your sample is human, and that's close enough to your population to count. So those are decisions that the researcher has to make to decide if they're okay not having a representative sample or not using random sampling. Now that we've talked about collecting data, now that we've talked about ways that we can describe our situation with our descriptive research, let's start talking about looking at that data. Not necessarily full statistics here, but we're going to start dabbling our toes into statistics. And so first, we're going to start talking about looking at our data and finding some kind of representative measure that could tell us something useful about that data. So one of the first things that we might talk about is a measure of central tendency, a way of describing the middle of your data. So maybe you've heard somebody talking about the average. The average person is 5 feet tall, or something like that. And there are a couple of different ways that we can talk about this central tendency, and the average is one of them. In science, it'll sometimes also be called the mean, and this is the average value of all of your measurements. So you would take all of the measurements that you have, add them all up, and divide by the total number of measurements. So if we were doing the height, you had 10 people, you would add all 10 people's heights together and divide by 10 to get our mean height for that sample. Another value that we could use is the median. This is the value that's in the middle of our distribution. So if you took all of the measurements that we took, you arranged people from the tallest to the shortest, the person that's standing in the middle, their height is our median value. That is the center of our distribution. And then the last of these is the mode, and this is the value of the most frequently observed measurement. I always forget this one, so I have to say that the mode occurs most often, and that phrase will always help me remember. But basically, you're looking for what is the most common measurement, what is the most common score. And this usually tends to be somewhere in the middle of a distribution, just due to probability. And again, for those of you that aren't word people, we have a visual representation of that here. So we could look at, in this case, we're looking at test scores. And so here we have a frequency distribution that's kind of like a histogram. A histogram would look more like this here. But if you imagine boxes around our little people, across the bottom we have a test score. So this looks like it would have been a test with 7 questions, and you could either get 1 right, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 7 of them right. And then on the side here, on the y-axis, and I forgot to mention this would be our x-axis, but on our y-axis we have the number of people who obtained that score. So our frequency of seeing that score. So we could read this saying that 2 people got 1 out of 7 on this test. We have 5 people got 3 out of 7 on the test, and so on and so forth. And at the top here, we've actually broken down what would the values be for our mean, median, and mode. So the mean, we add them all up and divide by the total number of people surveyed. So there were 15 people surveyed, so you add up all the scores and divide by 15. So that gives us 3.72. Our mode, because the mode occurs most often, is the highest bar here, the most people stacked together. So most people, 5 of them, got a score of 3. And the median's a little bit harder to visualize, but I would do something like start at the top and at the bottom and cross them off until you hit the middle. So I would do 1 and 1, 1 and 1, 1 and 1, 1, 1, back and forth until you arrive in the middle of your distribution. And so here, the person in the absolute middle, if we count in from both ends, also scored 3. So here, our mode was 3, and our median was 3, but our mean was slightly different at 3.75. So each of these different measurements, each of these different representations of the center of our data is going to give us a little bit different information. And as we start looking through some of the, as we start looking at different ways of looking at this data, we can talk about what our mean, median, and mode would look like. So first off, let's start by looking at a frequency distribution, but this time in the form of a line. So we still have on our y-axis the number of people with a particular score. On our x-axis, we're using a score. In this case, it looks like a score of fine motor skills test. So instead of a test out of 7, in this test you could score somewhere between 0 and 100. And if we want to read this data, we would look at the peak is highest right here. So this is where we have the most people, so the highest frequency. And that is telling us that a large number of people, almost 900 people, got in the range of about a 52 on this test. So we would say that our mode, the one that occurs most often, would be somewhere right in here. Now, because we're not seeing each individual score, it would actually be really difficult for us to figure out what our median would be. And we'd need to see each individual score to calculate a mean, but we can kind of use some shortcuts, and the fact that this is a symmetrical distribution tells us that all three measures should be somewhere in the middle of the data. So we should have our mean, median, and mode right in the middle here. And if we want to compare what the difference is between this blue line versus our orange line, we would see that our central tendency for the orange line, the scores for women, is going to be a little bit higher than the central tendencies for the blue line, which is the scores for men. So on average, women are scoring just a little bit higher than men on this particular test. And that's how we'd interpret that information. Now, when we're talking about these symmetrical distributions, you might have heard people talk about a normal distribution, also sometimes called a Gaussian distribution or a bell curve. Lots of different names for the same basic thing. But this normal distribution is going to be symmetrical. It's going to have a central peak that trails off to both sides. And in the technical side of things, there's usually 50% of the scores are going to be above that central peak, and 50% of our scores will be below because it's right in the middle. And like I said, when we were looking at this one here, our three different measures of central tendency, our mean, median, and mode, should all be right about in the middle there, all together. And we talk about a normal distribution because a lot of different measurements tend to follow a fairly normal distribution. So as long as you don't have a limit on your data, you tend to get a nice even distribution somewhere around the middle. So if you measured heights, you tend to have lots of people who are around the average height. You'll have a couple of people who are really tall and a couple of people who are really short, but most people will be right in the middle, giving us this fairly symmetrical curve. The same with grades or errors in measuring. Lots of stuff just happens to follow a normal distribution, which is why we talk about it. Instead of just talking about the middle of our data, we can also talk about something else called the variability, which is going to be a description of how much our measurements differ from one another. So we could look at something like the range. So what is the difference between the largest and the smallest measurement in our data? So if we hop ahead one slide here and we wanted to look at our range for this purple curve, our range would be from, say, 68 or so up to 130. So that is the range of our data. We could also talk about standard deviation, and this is something that we don't have to calculate because there are statistics classes for that. But we're going to look at standard deviation basically as describing the average difference between measurements in a frequency distribution and the mean of that distribution, which is a fancy way of saying how spread out are your data points. So if we come back to this graph here, we can actually start talking about what is the standard deviation, what is the variability here. And we can compare our purple curve, which is the scores for men, and our orange curve, which is the scores for women. Same basic setup, number of people with a particular score on the y-axis, and then the scores on the bottom on that x-axis. And so if we're looking at our standard deviation, we're comparing where those points fall relative to our center, our middle of our data, our central tendency. So here, our orange curve, the points tend to fall within a fairly small distance. They are closer to the middle, to our average, than the points that make up our purple curve. So we would say that there's less variability, there's less spread in the data for our orange curve than for the purple curve. We could also say the other way around and say that there's more variability, there's more data spread, the data is more spread out for that purple curve than for the orange curve. And that's about as much detail as I want us to talk about for variability here. We can also look at skewed data. So what happens if we don't have a perfectly normal curve? So we have here our nice normal curve, symmetrical, everything's sort of centered around the middle. Our mean, median, and mode are all fairly the same. But if we ended up getting a couple of extra scores that were large, so if we were looking at height and we had an average score of 5 feet tall, but maybe we have a new student join the class and they're 7 feet tall, that would add extra data points out over here. And so our tail on our graph would extend outward, which would give us something that looks kind of like this graph here, which is positively skewed. So if it is positively skewed, that means that on the right-hand side, the more positive side when looking at the graph, you're going to have extra scores that are further away from our central tendencies. And having those really large or really positive scores shifts our mean, median, and mode. So our mean, our average value, is the most affected by these very extreme scores. And we might call these extreme scores outliers if they are very far away from our data. But the mean is very easily maneuvered by having those large scores because of the way that we calculate it, where you add all the scores together and divide by the total number of scores. Having one very, very big number makes our mean a lot bigger. Our median is only a little bit influenced because now we have more scores on this side, so the median number, the number that's the central score, is going to be shifted more towards the positive side. And interestingly, our mode doesn't move because the peak is still there. So our most oftenly seen score is still going to be at the highest point on that curve. And then for the negatively skewed, it's going to be the same basic idea, but the opposite. So instead of having a very large score added, you're having very small or very negative scores added. And so that tail points to the negative side of our graph. And the same thing, the mean is most affected, the mode is least affected, and the median is going to be somewhere in the middle. And while we're talking about different ways to display data, sometimes you'll encounter box plots. And these look a little bit weird when you first see them, maybe difficult to interpret. But they're going to be giving us almost the exact same information as we're getting on these curves here. So for a box plot, to orient ourselves, this box here is going to be covering what they call 2 quartiles of data. And what that basically means is that we've divided our data up into quarters. So we have one line here. This is our median. This is the center of our data. We have another line here, 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 and here. And so we're going to be looking at the 4 quarters of our data. So we're saying that 25% of our scores fall in this range, 25% of our scores fall in here, 25% are here, and 25% are here. So this box in the middle, this box that goes from our first quartile to our third quartile, that's encompassing 50% of our data. That's half of all of the scores that we have. And these 2 lines tend to be a little bit closer together, and then we get some spread towards the outsides. Now, again, not necessarily super helpful to visualize, but what if I flipped our box plot on the side? And what if I did a little bit more drawing and I take our median, I'm going to raise that up. That's going to be the middle of our data. That's the highest point. And we would have sort of a curve that ends here at one side of our data, and a curve that kind of comes over here to this side of our data. So our median is that peak in the middle. We would have 25% of our data is in here, 25's over here. not the most perfect of graphs because I'm drawing with a mouse here, 25% here and 25% there. So this is just another way of representing one of these curves, but using boxes. And we also have, sometimes you'll see an outlier if we have determined that a particular measurement is way too extreme, we'll mark it as an outlier. But we won't have to calculate that. I just want you to know that you might see these. And again, you won't have to calculate a box plot. Just if you see one, know that it's still giving us the same basic information as our frequency curves, just in a slightly different format.